There is a moment in the Gospels that has disturbed readers for 2,000 years. A woman falls at the feet of Jesus, weeping, begging him to heal her daughter. And Jesus, the one who touched lepers, who raised the dead, who healed strangers with a word from across a room, says nothing. He walks right past her. And when his disciples press him for a response, he finally speaks. He looks at this sobbing mother and tells her, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Stop. Read that again. The man who said, "Come to me, all who are weary." The man who healed 10 lepers at once, who fed 5,000 strangers on a hillside, just compared a crying mother to a dog. At least, that's what it looks like on the surface. And here is where most people close their Bibles, or worse, walk away from faith entirely, because if Jesus said that, if those words mean what they appear to mean, then we have a serious problem on our hands. Not a theological debate, not a minor interpretive disagreement, a fundamental crisis about the character of the person that 2 billion people call Lord. But I want you to stay with me today, because what actually happened in Matthew chapter 15 is not what you've been told, and the answer is buried, not in a commentary, not in a sermon, but in the original Greek text, in the dust of a Phoenician road, and in a story told 1,000 years before this woman ever set foot in front of Jesus. By the time this video ends, you will see that this was not Jesus at his worst. This was Jesus at his most deliberate. And the woman he appeared to reject, she will turn out to be one of the most theologically sophisticated people in the entire New Testament. Let's go. We have to begin with where this story takes place, because the geography is not incidental. The geography is the entire point. Matthew 15 verse 21 says, "Then Jesus left that place and withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon." That single sentence would have made every Jewish reader of the first century catch their breath, because Tyre and Sidon were not neutral territory. They were not simply a foreign country. They were, in the religious imagination of ancient Israel, the heart of the pagan world. Tyre and Sidon sit on the coast of what is today southern Lebanon. In the ancient world, this was Phoenicia, a civilization of traders, sailors, and artisans whose culture had been woven through the history of Israel for centuries. And not always pleasantly. These were the people who built temples to Baal and Asherah. This was the homeland of Jezebel, the queen who tried to exterminate the prophets of God in the days of Elijah. This was land that the ancient Israelites considered ritually unclean, spiritually dangerous, and ethnically hostile. And Jesus walked straight into it. This is not a man who stumbled into Gentile territory by accident. He has just finished a sharp confrontation with the Pharisees and teachers of the law in Jerusalem, the official guardians of Jewish religious purity. He has told them publicly that their hand-washing ceremonies mean nothing, that what defiles a person is not what goes into the mouth, but what comes out of the heart. He has essentially declared war on the entire purity system that defined the boundary between clean and unclean, between Jew and Gentile. And then, as if to dramatize the point with his feet, he walks north, out of Galilee, across the border, into pagan territory. Think about what that means for a moment. Every step Jesus takes on Phoenician soil is, by Pharisaic standards, a step into contamination. Every breath of that air, every drop of that water, every stone under his sandals is technically unclean. The man who just told his disciples that purity is an inner reality, not an outer performance, is now performing that conviction with his body. He crosses the border, and then the text says something fascinating. In the parallel account in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verse 24, we're told that Jesus entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. He was trying to be invisible. He wanted solitude. He was apparently seeking rest from the crowds, from the debates, from the relentless pressure of public ministry. He didn't get it because verse 22 of Matthew 15 says, "A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him, crying out," a Canaanite woman. Matthew doesn't call her a Phoenician woman. He doesn't use the Greek word that Mark uses, Syrophoenician. He calls her a Canaanite. And that is a word deliberately chosen from the oldest layer of Israelite memory. The Canaanites were the original inhabitants of the Promised Land. They were the people Israel had been commanded to displace, the people whose religion was a constant temptation and whose presence was a constant threat. By the time of Jesus, there were virtually no people who identified as Canaanites. The civilization had been absorbed, dispersed, and largely forgotten for centuries. Matthew's choice to use this archaic term is like calling a modern French person a Gaul. It's reaching back deliberately, pulling up the deepest possible layer of ethnic and religious tension. This woman represents in one body everything that the disciples of Jesus had been trained to see as other, and she is screaming. The Greek word Matthew uses for her approach is krazo. It carries the connotation of urgent, piercing, animal-like crying. This is not a polite request. This is not a formal petition. This is a mother in absolute desperation, cutting through the noise of a Gentile street with everything she has left. "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Now pause here, because this sentence contains something extraordinary that we almost always miss. She calls Jesus Son of David. That is a messianic title. It is the title used by the Psalms, by the prophets, by every Jewish scripture that pointed toward the coming Messiah. It is the title that the crowds in Jerusalem would shout when Jesus entered the city on Palm Sunday. It is a title that says, "I know who you are. I know your lineage. I know what the prophecies say about you." This pagan woman in a pagan city is using the most specifically Jewish messianic language in existence. Where did she learn it? We don't know. Did she hear stories from Jewish merchants passing through Tyre? Did she encounter Jewish travelers who spoke of a healer from Galilee? Did she listen at doorways and piece together fragments of a theology that wasn't hers by birth? The text doesn't tell us, but she says the words. She says them correctly. She says them to his face. And Jesus does not answer her a word. This is the first test. And I want you to feel the full weight of this silence, because it is unbearable if you sit with it long enough. She's screaming. The word krazo is still ringing in our ears. And he, the compassionate one, the healer, the one who wept at the tomb of Lazarus, is walking in silence, as if she is not there. The disciples are not silent, though. Verse 23 says, "His disciples came to him and urged him, 'Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us.'" Now, what does that actually mean? Send her away. The Greek verb is apoluso. It can mean to dismiss, to release, to let go. And scholars have debated for centuries whether the disciples wanted Jesus to get rid of her, or whether they wanted him to heal her so she would stop following them and making noise. The charitable reading is that they wanted Jesus to grant her request quickly so the scene would end. The less charitable reading is that they were embarrassed and wanted her gone. Either way, and this is the critical point, they were treating her as a problem to be solved, not a person to be engaged. She was a complication, an inconvenience, a foreigner who didn't know her place. And Jesus responds to his disciples, not to her. He speaks over her, around her, as if explaining a policy. Verse 24, he answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." Second test. This statement needs to be heard in its full historical context. It is not a general theological principle. It is not a permanent declaration about the boundaries of God's grace. It is a statement about the specific mandate of Jesus' earthly ministry during his time on earth. A mission that, in its first phase, was directed at the restoration of Israel as the starting point for universal redemption. The logic of the gospel, as Paul will articulate it later, is first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. There is an order, there is a sequence, and Jesus is narrating that sequence out loud. But here is what is so devastating about the way he does it. He says it to the disciples, not to the woman. He is not explaining himself to her. He is explaining himself to them. He is holding a mirror up to their theology, their categories, their comfortable assumptions about who deserves access to divine power. He is externalizing their thoughts so that everyone, including her, can hear exactly what the prevailing religious logic sounds like when it's spoken plainly. It sounds like abandonment, and she does not leave. This is one of the most remarkable moments in the entire New Testament, and it passes by in a single verse. She heard the word Israel. She heard only. She heard herself excluded by theology before she was even addressed, and she came forward anyway. Verse 25, the woman came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. 3 words in Greek, Kyrie boethe moi, Lord, help me. She has dropped the full messianic title. She is no longer proclaiming his lineage. She is not making a theological argument. She is on her knees, her face to the ground, and she has reduced everything to its barest essence. Please. That's all. And this is where Jesus says the thing that has scandalized 2,000 years of readers. Verse 26. He replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. A metaphor has entered the conversation. The children, the family at the table, represent Israel, the covenant people. The bread represents the blessings of the messianic age, the healings, the miracles, the signs of the kingdom. And then there are the dogs. In the ancient Near East, calling someone a dog was one of the deepest possible insults. In Hebrew idiom, in Aramaic idiom, across the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean, a dog was not a beloved pet. A dog was a scavenger, a street creature, unclean by Torah standards, existing at the margins of human civilization. To call a person a dog was to say, you are outside the circle of civilization, outside the covenant, outside the category of those deserving of dignity. This is the word that has haunted this passage for 2 millennia. But here is where we have to stop and do something that most preachers never do. We have to open the Greek text and look at the actual word Jesus used. Because he didn't say Keon. In first century Greek, there were 2 words that could be translated as dog. The first is Keon, and this is the word used throughout the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, when the context is derogatory or hostile. Keon is the street dog, the pack animal, the unclean scavenger. When the Psalms speak of enemies surrounding the righteous like dogs, the word is Keon. When the book of Revelation describes those excluded from the holy city outside of the dogs, the word is Keon. Keon is an insult, but Jesus used the word Kunarion. Kunarion is a diminutive. It is literally little dog or puppy. And in the cultural context of the ancient Mediterranean household, a Kunarion was a domestic animal, a house pet, a small dog that lived under the table and ate the scraps that fell from the family meal. Not a street animal, not a scavenger, a creature that was already inside the house. This distinction is not a minor grammatical footnote. This distinction is everything. Jesus did not call this woman a dog in the derogatory, dismissive sense. He placed her, in the metaphor, inside the household, at the table, in proximity to the food. The only question within the metaphor was about sequence. Children first, then the dogs, not exclusion, sequence. And now look at what she does with that, because she is not just brave, she is brilliant. Verse 27. Yes, Lord, she said, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Read that again slowly, because this is theological judo. She does not reject the metaphor. She does not protest the metaphor. She does not say, I'm not a dog, how dare you? She walks into the metaphor, takes it in her hands, and turns it inside out. She says, if I am a Kunarion, if I am a little dog inside the house, then I am already close enough to the table to eat. And you know what? A Kunarion doesn't need the whole loaf. A Kunarion doesn't need to wait for the meal to end and the leftovers to be packaged. A Kunarion just needs one crumb, one fragment, one spillage of grace from the edge of the table. She is saying, I'm not asking to replace the children at the table. I'm not claiming equality of covenant position. I'm not arguing theology. I'm saying that your power is so enormous, so abundant, so inexhaustible, that the overflow alone, the pieces that fall off the edge without anyone even trying, is more than enough to heal my daughter. She has accepted the terms of the metaphor, accepted a position of humility, and from within that position of humility made an argument so airtight, so theologically precise, so utterly humble, and yet so devastatingly logical that it cannot be refused. This is the moment Jesus has been engineering from the beginning, and here is the turn that changes everything about how we read the whole passage. Let's go back to the silence. When Jesus didn't answer her, we read it as rejection. But what if it wasn't? What if the silence was the first test, not a test to exclude her, but a test to reveal her? What if Jesus needed to see whether she would persist, whether she would be shaken off, whether her faith had roots deep enough to survive the apparent absence of response? Because this is not the first time in the Gospels that Jesus uses silence as a diagnostic instrument. When the disciples are caught in a storm and he is asleep in the boat, that's not indifference. That's a test of where their trust actually lives. When Lazarus is sick and Jesus deliberately stays away for 2 more days, John records this explicitly. He is not being cruel. He is creating the conditions for a greater revelation. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes silence is the deepest kind of attention. And when Jesus spoke to the disciples, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel, he was not writing this woman off. He was giving voice to the theology that the disciples were thinking but not saying. He was forcing the exclusionary assumption into the open air where it could be examined, where she could respond to it, where everyone standing on that dusty road could hear exactly how religious privilege sounds when it speaks plainly. He was not describing his own limits, he was describing theirs. And then came the metaphor, and she passed through it like water through a net. Verse 28, Jesus' response. Then Jesus said to her, Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at that moment. 2 things demand our attention here. The first is the word woman, in Greek, ginai. It's the same form of address Jesus uses to speak to his mother at the wedding in Cana and from the cross. It is not dismissive. It is formal and even respectful in the context of the 1st century. It carries something like madam or dear woman, an honorific in a culture where women were often not addressed directly at all. The second, and more important, is the phrase, great is your faith. Megalisso hepistis, great is your faith. This is an extraordinarily rare declaration. Search the Gospels carefully, and you will find that Jesus evaluated faith consistently. He noted its presence. He noted its absence. He occasionally said, your faith has healed you. But only twice in all 4 Gospels does Jesus specifically describe someone's faith as great, as megas, as belonging to an entirely different category than what he ordinarily encountered. Here, and the Roman centurion in Matthew chapter 8. Look at what those 2 people have in common. Neither of them is Jewish. Both of them are outsiders by birth, outsiders by culture, outsiders by every religious category the 1st century could apply. And both of them display a theological understanding that surpasses in that moment everyone around them, including the disciples. The centurion said, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. He understood authority. He understood that Jesus didn't need proximity to perform a miracle. He understood something about the nature of divine command that the disciples who had watched Jesus heal dozens of people had apparently not yet grasped. And this Canaanite woman understood something about the inexhaustible abundance of grace, that even the overflow of divine power is greater than any human need. Two outsiders, two examples of great faith, as if Jesus is deliberately constructing a curriculum. The people you have been taught to overlook may be further along than you think, but now we need to travel back in time, 1,000 years, because this road Jesus is walking, this Phoenician coastal road, has been walked before. And the story that happened on this same stretch of coastline may be the most important interpretive key in this entire passage. In 1 Kings chapter 17, the prophet Elijah is on the run. He has just declared a drought over Israel at God's command, and now the drought is devastating everything, including the brook where Elijah himself has been drinking. God gives him new instructions. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. Zarephath. The name in Hebrew is Zarephath, and it means place of refining, place of smelting, a place where metal is put through fire to burn away the impurities and reveal the pure substance beneath. Where is Zarephath? On the coast of Phoenicia, between Tyre and Sidon, exactly where Jesus is walking in Matthew 15. Elijah arrives at the gate of the city. He sees a widow gathering sticks. He asks her for water and a piece of bread, and she tells him, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. She is down to her last meal. She is preparing her family's final food before starvation claims them, and into this scene walks a prophet of Israel who asks her to feed him first. The logic is identical. Israel's prophet is asking a Phoenician widow, a Gentile, an outsider, a person of the wrong ethnicity, to participate in the covenant logic of children first, to give her last handful of flour to the representative of Israel before she feeds herself and her son. And she does it. And the flour does not run out. The oil does not run out. Every day she reaches into the jar and finds exactly what she needs. And later, when her son dies, Elijah raises him back to life. 1,000 years before Jesus walks this road, God sent a prophet of Israel to a Phoenician widow in a place called the Refinery. And she fed the prophet, and the miracle came. Now do you see what Jesus is doing? When he walks into Phoenicia, he is not wandering. He is not lost. He is placing his feet deliberately on the same ground where Elijah walked. He is walking into the same geography of testing and refinement. He is, in a sense, reenacting the story, because this is what the Son of David does. He inhabits the patterns that the prophets traced and fills them with something larger than the original. And even Jesus in Luke chapter 4 refers to this story himself. When he preaches in the synagogue in Nazareth and the crowd turns hostile, he points to it directly. I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. He says it himself. The pattern has always been there. The grace has always leaked across the borders. The prophets of Israel have always, at critical moments, been sent not to the most religiously qualified, but to those who had nothing to offer except faith and need. And now a Canaanite woman, a descendant culturally and geographically of the widow of Zarephath, is standing in front of a greater than Elijah. And she is asking for the same thing the widow asked for. Don't let my child die. The story has come full circle, 1,000 years later on the same coastline, Zarephath, place of refinement, place where impurities are burned away and the real substance is revealed. This is what has been happening to the Canaanite woman throughout this encounter. She has been put through the fire of silence, the fire of theological exclusion, the fire of the dog metaphor. And what has been revealed? Not impurity, not unworthiness, not the thing the disciples were hoping would be revealed, a reason to send her away. What has been revealed is faith, pure, refined, indestructible faith. Now I want to come back to the disciples, because they are present in this entire scene, and we have not finished examining their role. When the disciples say, "Send her away," they are not being neutral observers, they are participants. And Jesus does something in this passage that he does repeatedly throughout his ministry. He uses an external situation to hold a mirror up to his disciples' inner world. The disciples had left their fishing boats, their tax tables, their ordinary lives. They had followed Jesus for months. They had watched him heal the sick, feed the multitude, walk on water. They had been given authority to cast out demons and cure diseases. They had heard the Sermon on the Mount. They had sat at his feet for hundreds of hours of teaching. And their instinct, when a desperate mother came screaming down the road, was to make her stop, to make her invisible, to classify her problem as a disturbance rather than a need. This is the tragedy of religious formation that stops at the level of ritual and doctrine but never reaches the level of compassion. The disciples knew the law. They knew the categories. They knew who was in and who was out. And that knowledge, in this moment, was actively preventing them from seeing a human being. But let's be precise about what kind of blindness this is, because it matters enormously for how we evaluate our own hearts. The disciples were not evil people. They were not consciously malicious. They were products of a formation system, the synagogue, the Torah, the oral tradition, that had spent centuries building exactly these categories for genuinely theological reasons. The distinction between clean and unclean was not invented by the Pharisees as a power grab. It was woven into the covenant structure of Israel as a way of marking out a community called to be different, holy, set apart. There were good reasons the fence was built. The problem is not the fence itself. The problem is what happens to the human heart after the fence has been standing for long enough that you forget why it was originally built. After a few generations, the fence stops being a marker of holiness and starts being a marker of privilege. It stops saying we are called to a different standard and starts saying we are a different kind of people. The protection of identity becomes the protection of superiority. And that is where the disciples were standing when this woman ran toward them screaming. They did not see a mother. They saw a complication. They did not see suffering. They saw noise. They did not see faith seeking an outlet. They saw an outsider pressing against the border and demanding access to something she hadn't earned. And here is the devastating irony of their position. They were standing next to the man who had said 3 chapters earlier in Matthew 12 that he would proclaim justice to the Gentiles, that a bruised reed he would not break, that a smoldering wick he would not snuff out. They had heard those words, they believed them, and they still missed this woman's need because the categories in their minds were faster than the compassion in their hearts. Theology can outrun love. That is the lesson the disciples are teaching us by negative example. Jesus doesn't rebuke them directly. He doesn't say, "You should be ashamed of yourselves." He does something far more effective. He stages an entire demonstration in front of their eyes. He lets the encounter play out. He makes them hear their own theological assumptions spoken aloud from his mouth. "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." He makes them watch this woman absorb every obstacle and refuse to be turned away. He makes them stand there as she argues her case with such grace and precision that Jesus himself declares her faith great. They cannot argue with what they have seen, and they cannot unfeel what they have felt when they watched it. The lesson is not delivered as a lecture. The lesson is delivered as a lived experience that they cannot unremember. And this is one of Jesus' characteristic pedagogical moves. He teaches through encounter, not through proposition. He does not give a sermon about the universality of grace and then dismiss the class. He creates a situation in which the universality of grace becomes undeniable, in which the best possible argument for their existing categories is made and then surpassed, in which the woman they wanted to send away becomes the protagonist of the most memorable story they will carry for the rest of their lives. Years later, when Peter stands on the rooftop in Joppa and sees the vision of the sheet descending with all manner of animals, and hears the voice say, "Kill and eat," and when he protests that he has never eaten anything unclean, and when the voice answers, "What God has made clean, do not call unclean," do you think for even a moment that this Canaanite woman was not somewhere in his memory? The woman whose faith Jesus called great. The woman they had tried to send away. The Kunarion, who turned out to have more theology in her response than the disciples had in their collective instincts. This road in Phoenicia was the beginning of a very long education. There is a dimension of this passage that we need to sit with before we move to the ending. The question of what faith actually is, because this woman defines it for us, not in words, but in posture. Faith, in the popular imagination, is often understood as a kind of confidence, a bold, unwavering certainty that God will do what you ask. Name it and claim it. Believe and receive. Come to God expecting the blessing, and the blessing will come. And there is truth in that. But the Canaanite woman's faith is something more complex, more honest, and ultimately more powerful. Her faith survived silence. She cried out and got nothing. The one she had been told was the son of David, the healer, the miracle worker. He walked past her as if she were part of the landscape, and she kept crying. She did not interpret the silence as a no. She did not take the absence of immediate response as evidence that she had been wrong to come. This is worth slowing down to examine carefully, because the theology of divine silence is one of the most underdeveloped areas in popular Christian thinking. We have developed over centuries of preaching and praise music and devotional literature a model of prayer that is almost entirely based on transaction. You ask, God answers. The answer comes quickly when your faith is strong, slowly when it needs to be built up, or not at all when there is sin to be confessed. But the Canaanite woman's silence is not explained by any of those categories. She is not sinning. She is not doubting. She is not lacking in faith. We know this because of how the story ends. She is simply waiting in the most terrifying space a human being can occupy, the space between a prayer sent and an answer not yet received. And here is the theological truth that her story forces us to confront. The silence of God is not always the absence of God. Sometimes, as in the case of Lazarus, where Jesus deliberately waited, the silence is the precondition for a greater revelation. The delay is not indifference. The delay is architecture. Something is being built in the silence that cannot be built any other way. The experience of every major figure of faith in the biblical tradition includes a period of waiting that felt like abandonment. Abraham waited 25 years for the son of promise after the initial call. Joseph spent 13 years in slavery and prison before the dream came true. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before the burning bush. David was anointed king and then spent years hiding from the man he was anointed to replace. The pattern is so consistent that it can no longer be coincidence. The waiting is part of the formation. But knowing that truth as a theological proposition is one thing. Living inside it, when your daughter is suffering and the healer is walking away, is another thing entirely. What the Canaanite woman did with the silence is the hardest thing faith ever asks of us. She refused to let the silence be the final word. She stayed present. She kept making noise. She pressed forward when the pressure of the situation said clearly, "This is not for you. Turn back. You've misread the situation. You were wrong to come." She was not wrong to come. She was exactly right to come. And the silence was not a door closing. The silence was a door that had not yet opened. Her faith survived exclusion. When Jesus spoke, and the words that came out of his mouth seemed to confirm her worst fear, that this grace was for someone else, that the covenant was a private club she hadn't been born into, she did not collapse. She did not walk away with a theology of divine rejection that she would carry for the rest of her life. She came closer. Her faith survived the most humiliating metaphor. Being compared to a dog, even a domestic dog, even a little Kunarion under the table, it is still a diminutive position. It is still a subordinate place in the household hierarchy. And rather than rejecting the metaphor in anger, she inhabited it with such complete humility and such breathtaking theological precision that she transformed it. She didn't fight the metaphor, she fulfilled it. This is what great faith looks like. Not the absence of obstacles, not a clear road from prayer to answer, not an immediate enthusiastic divine yes. Great faith is faith that persists through the silence and comes out the other side still standing. And there is a pastoral reality here that cannot be avoided, because the story of the Canaanite woman is not just a first-century story about ethnic boundaries and messianic sequencing. It is a map for every person who has ever prayed and heard nothing. You have prayed for a child who is suffering. You have waited at a door that did not open. You have come to God with your need laid bare and felt in the silence that you were invisible. And the temptation in those moments is to do what the disciples were suggesting the woman should do. Go away. Take the silence as the final word. Accept that perhaps the grace is for someone else, the healing is for someone else, the promise is for someone else. But this woman did not go away. She came closer. And when she got close enough to speak, she did not present her credentials. She did not argue for her worthiness. She said, "Even a crumb from your table is enough for me." And the crumb became a complete healing. There is one more detail in this story that the text gives us, and it is easy to miss because we are watching the main event so closely. When Jesus said, "Let it be done for you as you wish," the text says, her daughter was healed at that moment. The Greek phrase is apotes horas ekines, from that hour, instantly, completely. At a distance, the mother had to walk back home, not knowing what she would find. She had no way to verify the healing until she arrived. She had to carry the faith the whole way, the whole journey back across the same road she had come down screaming. Only now she was walking in silence of a different kind, not the silence of being ignored, the silence of holding something fragile and enormous, a promise, a word. The word of a man whose capacity she had just matched, argument for argument, on a dusty road in Phoenicia. When she pushed open the door of her home and saw her daughter lying there, calm, whole, free, what did that moment feel like? The text doesn't say. It doesn't need to. The daughter is resting. The demon is gone. The mother stands in the doorway. Outside, 1,000 years of walls have crumbled in the space of an afternoon. The bread has reached the table. The crumb was more than enough. Now let's pull back to the full picture, because what Matthew chapter 15 gives us is not a troubling exception to the gospel. It is one of its clearest statements. The encounter with the Canaanite woman is Matthew's answer to the question, what does the grace of God actually look like when it meets the boundaries that human beings construct? Because we build these boundaries everywhere. Ethnic boundaries, religious boundaries, Social boundaries, the boundaries of who is worthy, who is clean, who has the right genealogy, who belongs to the right covenant, who was born in the right place to the right parents in the right century. And the grace of God in this story does not politely observe those boundaries. It does not sit inside them and wait for the people outside to earn their way in. It walks across the border into pagan territory. It walks straight into the geography where the oldest boundaries between Israel and the nations were drawn. And it waits to see who is brave enough to chase it. The Canaanite woman was brave enough to chase it, brave enough to absorb 3 tests of increasing intensity and not let go, brave enough to be humble in the most theologically precise way imaginable. And her reward was not simply a miracle. Her reward was a declaration from the mouth of Jesus that placed her in a category with fewer than 5 people in the entire Gospels. Great faith, megas. The faith of an outsider who understood grace better than the insiders did. Think about what Matthew is doing with the structure of his gospel here. In chapter 8, he tells the story of the Roman centurion, also an outsider, also a Gentile, also declared to have great faith. In chapter 15, here is this Canaanite woman, 2 foreigners, 2 examples of extraordinary faith. And sandwiched between them, in chapters 11 through 14, a parade of rejection from the people who should have recognized Jesus most immediately. The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida, even John the Baptist asking from prison whether Jesus was really the one. Matthew is building a case. The case is not that Israel is condemned and the Gentiles are blessed. The case is that faith is not an ethnic quality. Faith is not a function of religious pedigree. Faith is not inherited through bloodline or cultivated through ritual. Faith is what happens when a person encounters the reality of grace and refuses to let it go, no matter how many obstacles appear in the path. The centurion had it. The Canaanite woman had it, and both of them found it in the most unlikely place, not in the synagogue, not in the temple, not in years of study under the rabbis, but in a moment of desperate need on a road, in a house, at a distance, with a child dying and nothing left to lose. And it's worth pausing to ask, why were these 2, specifically, the ones Jesus praised above almost everyone else? What did they have in common beyond their Gentile status? They both came to Jesus entirely outside the normal channels. There was no rabbi to recommend them, no introduction through the synagogue network, no letter of credibility from a recognized teacher. They had no institutional backing. They had heard things about this man, rumors, stories, fragments of testimony from people who had seen, and they had decided that the rumors were worth staking everything on. In a world before mass communication, before printing, before any mechanism for distributing information beyond word of mouth and occasional written letters, this kind of faith required something that religious insiders often lacked: the willingness to act on incomplete information. The Pharisees had libraries, they had lineages of interpretation, they had centuries of accumulated commentary, and they used all of it to construct a portrait of the Messiah that the actual Messiah did not fit. They were drowning in information and missing the reality. The centurion and the Canaanite woman had almost nothing: stories, second-hand accounts, the reputation of a healer from a region they didn't belong to. And they decided to bet everything on those fragments. There is a kind of faith that emerges only in the absence of certainty. A faith that cannot fall back on credentials or heritage or institutional standing. A faith that is pure need meeting pure trust, with nothing in between. The Canaanite woman had nothing to fall back on. No covenant standing, no religious authorization, no insider access. She had a dying daughter and a rumor that there was someone in Phoenicia who might be able to do something about it. That was enough. That turned out to be exactly enough. Let's come back to that word she used when she first called out to Jesus. "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me." Elison me. Have mercy on me. In the Greek liturgical tradition, this phrase became the most ancient and essential of all prayers, the Kyrie eleison. Lord, have mercy. It is the prayer that strips away every credential, every argument, every elaborate theological framework. It is the prayer that says, I am not coming with a case to be made. I am coming with a need to be met. And the word elison, mercy, carries layers that the English translation doesn't fully capture. It comes from the Greek elios, which is itself the translation of the Hebrew chesed, one of the most theologically dense words in the entire Old Testament. Chesed means loving kindness, yes, but it also means covenant faithfulness. It means the kind of love that does not abandon, that does not revoke, that does not expire when circumstances change. When the Psalms say, your steadfast love endures forever, it is chesed. When Hosea speaks of the love of God that refuses to give up on an unfaithful people, chesed. And this Canaanite woman, this Phoenician outsider, is reaching across the entire structure of the covenant she was never born into and asking for chesed. Not as a member of the covenant, not as someone with a right to make the claim, but as someone who has heard enough about this man to believe that the quality of his mercy is not bounded by the categories of his culture. She is asking for the thing that Israel was supposed to receive as a birthright, not because she was born into it, but because she would not stop asking. This is what the Canaanite woman taught the church how to pray before the church existed. She demonstrated the posture of authentic faith, not the triumphant faith of someone who already has the answer, but the persistent faith of someone who will keep knocking until the door opens. There is a silence in God sometimes. Every person of faith has experienced it, the silence that feels like absence, the silence that makes you wonder whether the prayer is reaching anyone, whether the words are disappearing into empty air, whether the God you believe in is paying attention to your specific, particular, irreplaceable need. The silence that Jesus gave this woman for a few moments on a Phoenician road is the silence that some people live inside for months or years. And the question that her story puts to all of us is not, why is God silent? The question is, what do you do with the silence? She came closer. She came closer. She got on her knees. She spoke 3 words. She met the metaphor with grace, and she walked home with everything she had asked for. What's at stake in how we read Matthew 15 is enormous. Because if Jesus was genuinely dismissing this woman out of ethnic prejudice, if the text means what it appears to mean on its surface, then we have a gospel that is fundamentally compromised at its center. A savior who needed to be educated out of bigotry by a desperate foreign woman. A deity whose compassion has a geographic boundary. But if we read it as we have been reading it today, if we look at the original Greek, if we follow the geographical footprints back to Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, if we pay attention to the structure of 3 tests and the deliberate orchestration of a demonstration for the disciples, then we have something entirely different. We have a master teacher who engineered one of the most sophisticated moments of revelation in his entire ministry, who used silence as a diagnostic, who used his disciples' own biases as a teaching tool, who used a cultural metaphor not to exclude a woman, but to give her a platform on which to stand and display in front of everyone watching the quality of faith that he had come looking for. The word dogs in this passage is not an insult, it is a test, and she passed it with a brilliance that has not been surpassed in 2,000 years of theological history. There is one final layer of this story that I want to give you before we close. In the ancient Near East, there was a concept that the Hebrew tradition expressed through the word zareph, to refine, to smelt, to put metal through fire. The book of Proverbs uses it, the Psalms use it, Zechariah uses it. I will put this third into the fire and refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. The place where the widow of Zarephath lived, the place where Elijah went, Zarephath, Zarephath, Refinery. And now Jesus walks back to that same territory 1,000 years later, and he finds another woman there, and he puts her through fire. Not fire of cruelty, fire of refinement. 3 tests of increasing intensity: silence, exclusion, metaphor, designed not to destroy her but to reveal her, designed to answer a question not for his benefit but for everyone else's benefit, designed to take what was inside her and bring it into the open where it could be seen. And what came out of the fire? Great faith. Megas, the biggest word in Jesus' vocabulary of evaluation. She walked into the refinery. She came out gold. Her daughter, waiting at home in the grip of whatever darkness had taken hold of her, was released at the exact moment her mother's faith was declared great. Because that is how it works in the economy of the kingdom Jesus was announcing. The breakthrough that comes to those who love us is sometimes released not when we ourselves prove worthy, but when someone who loves us refuses to stop believing. The daughter was healed at that hour, and across the sea, across the centuries, across every boundary that human beings have erected to define who is inside and who is outside the reach of grace, the bread is still falling from the table, and there is more than enough for everyone who is willing to get close enough to receive even a crumb.